All right, we will get started here. Hello, church history friends. My name, if you don't know it after this whole lecture series, is Peter Smith, and tonight I will serve as your host for our final lecture in the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation Summer Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening and throughout the series as we have explored church history together over the past 8 weeks. My brief remarks will end around 7:05 Central USA time. Barb will then begin her lecture and slideshow, a presentation that will run close to 40 minutes in length. And at the close of her lecture, around 7:45, we will open up the floor for questions from you, from the audience. Our program will draw to a close around 8 o'clock p.m. Central this evening, giving us a full hour of church history fun. When Barb finishes her presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions. We encourage you to post your questions through the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. Please, we want to remind you, try to avoid posting your questions in the chat thread, only because the chats fill up quickly and we may miss your important question. I also want to introduce you to my co-host this evening, Megan Reed. Megan is working on her master's degree at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and this summer she is serving as a student intern for the Kirtland Temple and is assisting behind the scenes throughout the lecture series. Thank you so much, Megan. We have appreciated you so much throughout the series. It was announced last week that Community of Christ Historic Sites will be closed until the end of the year. It was a difficult decision, but one made for the safety of our visitors, volunteers, and staff due to COVID-19. Despite the closure, though, the stories from church history and the preservation and maintenance of the historic sites continues on even in the midst of a pandemic. Donations received from today's lecture will help support the Community of Christ Historic Sites. In fact, the Board of Directors has promised to double the first $12,000 in donations received during our summer campaign, which just recently started. So actually, any gift you give tonight will be doubled. So Megan has dropped an online donation link in the chat box, along with an address for those who wish to donate by mail. Thank you, Megan. Now for our evening program. Tonight, we will hear from Barb Walden, who will share a lecture titled The Life and Legacy of Marietta Hodges Falconer Walker. But first, let me introduce you to our guest speaker this evening. Barbara Walden is the Executive Director of the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation, a position she has held for nearly 10 years. She is the former site director of the Kirtland Temple and past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association. Barb also serves as one of 3 official church historians for Community of Christ. Welcome, Barb. We're happy to see you tonight. Thank you for joining us. I'll turn the microphone over to you as we are all ready to hear Marietta Walker's story.
Thank you, Peter. I'm all ready to share Marietta Walker's story. But just like a lot of the work that Marietta did in the reorganization, she was surrounded by other women who helped in creating women's organizations and writing for the Herald. And in much of the work she did, there were other women involved. And I find that it was symbolic in many ways that as I researched Marietta Walker's story, I relied on so many other women who came before me who did just the same, who researched Marietta Walker's history. Those women include Barbara Howard and Junia Braby, Cleo Hanthorne Moon, and others. So much of what I'm going to share today comes from the research papers that Barbara Howard and Junia Braby put together so many years ago. It was incredible research, and I feel greatly blessed to have that research on hand, thanks to the generosity of Barbara Howard. It also gave me a much deeper insight into Marietta Walker's story. I was a fan of Marietta Walker's before, but now that I've sifted through all the research that Barbara and Junia have done over the years, I feel like I'm all the more Team Marietta than ever before. So it's a joy to share Marietta's story with you this evening. I'm going to share the screen because I'd like to feature a number of photos from the church archives, in addition to some great maps created by John Hamer. I hope you're all able to see this. Frederick Madison Smith, former president of Community of Christ and first graduate of Graceland College, once said, "No one has done more for the work of the reorganization than Marietta Walker." Excuse me. Marietta Walker was born in 1834 in Willoughby, Ohio, a community located right next door to Kirtland. Marietta was the youngest of 13 children born to Curtis Hodges and Lucy Clark Hodges. Her parents learned about the restoration while living in Bath, New York. The family relocated to Ohio, where a church community was being established in Kirtland in the early 1830s. Shortly after they arrived in Ohio, Marietta was born on April 10, 1834. Not much can be found of the Hodges family during their time in Ohio. Her father, Curtis Hodges Sr., appears in a trial before the High Council in February of 1834. Curtis was charged by Elder Ezra Thayer with talking too loud in meetings, and he was unbecoming of an elder. Elder Hodges pled not guilty to the charges. Minutes to the High Council meeting state that, quote, Elder Hodges talked so loud at a prayer meeting that the neighbors came out to see if someone was hurt, end quote. There were a few more testimonies of Elder Hodges talking too loudly or hallooing, so much that he lost his own voice. In the end, Elder Hodges rose and said he was wrong, and he learned more during this trial than he had since he came into the church. The council forgave him, and the meeting was adjourned. When you take a moment to consider the context of Marietta's family's geographical proximity to church history, it's really fascinating. Her parents converted to the church while living in Western New York in the early 1830s. The Hodges gathered to Ohio and were living in the Kirtland area when Zion's Camp began its march to Jackson County, Missouri in 1834. It was in Ohio that the first Council of 12 was ordained, and the priesthood structure that we know today was continuing to be formed. The Hodges would have known about the construction of the Kirtland Temple and its later dedication in 1836. It's possible that some of the Hodge family members attended that dedication. They would have been familiar with the Kirtland Anti-Baking Company, its demise, and the significant impact it left on church members during this time. The family then went on to Missouri and eventually Nauvoo, just like the traditional restoration trail often depicts in church history. Like many church members in Northeast Ohio, the Hodges moved to northern Missouri in 1838. They would have experienced the tensions felt between church members and their surrounding communities. Family tradition states that Curtis Hodges Sr. was injured in a scuffle around the time of the Battle of Crooked River and the Haun's Mill Massacre. Marietta's older sister, Sarah Hodges Waite, had given birth to her third child and was confined to bed when a mob of men forced themselves into her home and went through her drawers and trunks during this time. When the men turned to approach Sarah as she lied in bed, she put her hand under her pillow and quietly told them she would fire upon the first man who touched her bed. And though she had no weapon there, the look of determination upon her face and her coolness of manner, together with her reaching for a supposed weapon, forced the men to retreat. The family would have known the forced exodus of the church from Missouri to Illinois, and like so many of the early church members, would have eventually found refuge in Nauvoo, if only temporary refuge. Marietta was a classmate of Joseph Smith III and his brothers. Like the rest of the Nauvoo community, Marietta and her family were deeply affected by the deaths of Joseph and Hiram Smith in 1844. She was only 10 years old when her father led her by the hand through the funeral procession for Joseph and Hiram. She remembered walking into the mansion house and the overwhelming smell. Her father lifted her up so that she could view Joseph and Hiram's bodies as they lied in their caskets. This was an experience that impacted her for the rest of her life. It was also during the Nauvoo years that two of her brothers were accused of murder, found guilty, and hanged. A third brother was shot in Nauvoo around the same period. The death of her brothers was a scandal and something Marietta rarely discussed with her own family, let alone in public. Her daughter Lois said that Marietta feared that, quote, someone would trace back and publish the fact that she was a Hodges sister to the two boys, that they were hanged in Burlington and the one shot down in Nauvoo. Well, filled with a mixture of grief and bitterness, the Hodges moved to Pennsylvania to gather with Sidney Rigdon's church in 1845. Her father served as a high priest on the Grand Council of the Church of Christ under the leadership of Sidney Rigdon. In addition, Curtis Hodges worked manufacturing wooden pegs for boats. West Elizabeth was a boat-building city at the time. Her mother managed a boarding house in the mining community. And it was while living there in Pennsylvania that Marietta's family crossed paths with Elijah Banta, a new convert to Sidney Rigdon's church. Elijah eventually married Marietta's older sister, Emeline. Elijah quickly became a permanent fixture in Marietta's life, often generously supporting her many endeavors. Not long after her father's death in 1846, Marietta left Pennsylvania with her mother and brother for a new life in St. Louis. Marietta's sister, Lucy Ann Billings, lived in St. Louis and was the chief reason for the relocation. It's also possible that her older sister, Sarah, and her husband traveled with Marietta, or they were already established in St. Louis at this time. In Missouri, Marietta attended a school for girls and later taught at this school. Here she joins the Methodist Church and for the first time discovers a life outside the Latter-day Saint movement. Marietta considered the St. Louis years of her life among the happiest of times. She had her first journalistic experience in editing a Sunday school paper for the Methodist Church, where she attended. She also had an active social life, and according to her daughter, fielded a number of marriage proposals while in St. Louis. She later returned to the river town after many years away. She described the return, quote, "While we were there, I met and visited with an old flame. The heart does not grow old," end quote. However, tragedy returned to the family in the late 1840s. A cholera outbreak consumed St. Louis during this time and took the life of Marietta's brother, James, her sister, Lucy, and her brother-in-law. Well, soon Marietta and her mother were back on the road, this time headed east to Indiana, where Elijah and Emeline Banta had settled after departing Pennsylvania. Although Elijah was born in Shelby County, Kentucky, he grew up in Indiana. The Banta family owned and operated a farm in Johnson County, not far from Indianapolis. As Elijah's father grew older, he asked Elijah to move back home to help on the farm. Elijah and Emeline agreed, and by the time Marietta and Lucy Hodges arrived in Indiana, the Banta family was fairly settled. Elijah did pretty well farming. He also took up politics while living in Indiana. He was elected to the Indiana General Assembly on a Republican ticket, the first Republican elected from his district. He served as a county auditor for a brief period. He has a fascinating story, and I really wish I had time to explore his life and legacy with you, but we'll have to save that for another day. Elijah had a significant impact on the Hodges family, especially Marietta. He emphasized the importance of education to Marietta, and perhaps that's because he was unable to pursue his own educational aspirations when he was younger. Family tradition states that Elijah and Emeline financially supported Marietta's education at the Oxford Female College in Oxford, Ohio, where she graduated in 1859. Her years at the Oxford College were formative years. Shortly after her graduation in 1859, Marietta took off for San Antonio, Texas. She writes about this decision decades later in a letter to her alma mater. And she says, "A short time before I left Oxford, an older sister died at her home in San Antonio, Texas, having obtained a promise from her husband that he would place her two daughters in my care. This led me into the far South, where I remained during the entire Civil War." The sister that Marietta refers to is Eliza Jane Hodges Lyon. She married a doctor, J.H. Lyons, who practiced as a surgeon in San Antonio. Marietta relocated to San Antonio area to care for her two nieces. Well, during her stay in Texas, she met Robert Faulkner, and on August 2nd, 1860, they were married. The following year, they welcomed the birth of their daughter, Lucy, named after her grandmother, or Marietta's mother, Lucy Hodges. In the Oxford College letter referenced earlier, she said the following about Robert and her time spent in San Antonio. She writes, "I had married before the war cloud darkened the skies, and my husband, a Virginian, was born and bred a Southerner. He enlisted in the service at the beginning of the war. It is well known to those acquainted with the sentiment of Southern men in those days that to remain at home while every friend and neighbor was enlisted in the Southern Army was a disgrace." Well, Faulkner became ill during the war. Marietta received word of his condition and was anxious to be with him. Family tradition said that she petitioned and received a presidential pass to break through the fighting line to be with him. Robert passed away of yellow fever in 1862 while home from the war on furlough. Well, it was also during her time in San Antonio that she was approached about a leadership role at the San Antonio Female College. Here you can see an advertisement for the new school as it appeared in the Alamo Express in September of 1860. The Reverend Boring was the minister of the Methodist congregation that Marietta attended. Boring also performed the wedding ceremony for her and Robert in 1860. Marietta described Boring's proposal to lead the school. She says, "The Reverend Dr. Jesse Boring, who had the appointing power, came to me begging that I would take charge of the school, at least until a man could be found to relieve me. After serious reflection, I consented to this proposition, and no one was found to take my place until just before the close of the war. I gave my best efforts to sustaining and building up this school that today is a flourishing institution by the name of Westmoreland. This was the beginning of my public work." Well, in 1865, Marietta learned that her mother's health was declining, and the Banta family was moving Lucy Hodges to Sandwich, Illinois, a center for the reorganization. With her husband gone and her nieces old enough to care for themselves, Marietta felt the urge to see her mother in Illinois. Some suspect her urge was partially due to the news that they were once again involved in a Latter-day Saint church. Travel from Texas to northern Illinois was no easy task in the spring of 1865. In a letter to Olive Flower, she describes her journey. She writes, "I resolved to attempt going to New York by way of Mexico and Cuba. In this attempt, I succeeded, my little daughter being my companion in this long and perilous journey. At Havana, we were met by the news of Lincoln's assassination, and on arriving in New York, we went the same day to the Capitol to pass with a weeping multitude where his body lay in state. From there, I went to friends in Indianapolis and later to my mother in Sandwich, Illinois." According to her daughter, Frances, Marietta was not particularly fond of Lincoln. Frances said her sympathies were with the South. She prayed for the Southern cause, though not favoring slavery. She did not care to view Lincoln's remains, though twice she crossed the funeral cortege, I've heard her say. Marietta and Lucy arrived in Sandwich during the spring of 1865. Shortly after her arrival, she received word from her alma mater offering her a faculty position back in Oxford, Ohio. She turned down the opportunity, saying, quote, "The war, the long journey, and many changes had racked my nerves, and I did not consider the call to resume teaching," end quote. Although she left Texas to be close to family and assist her aging mother, that didn't mean she was going to warmly embrace the reorganization. As I mentioned earlier, involvement in the Latter-day Saint movement brought a lot of hardships to her family. It's understandable that Marietta would hesitate to join another Latter-day Saint church led by another Joseph Smith. In Sandwich, the Banta home included a lot of reorganization activity. Church leaders were often at the house, and her brother-in-law, Elijah, was one of those key leaders. Perhaps it was these personal relationships that eventually brought Marietta around to considering the reorganization. Joseph Smith III, an old Nauvoo classmate of Marietta's, invited her to be baptized. However, Marietta was still Marietta, even as she agreed to baptism. She told Joseph Smith III, "I will accept your proposition. I will be baptized, and if I receive a testimony of the truthfulness of this work, I will do all in my power to further the interests of the church. But if, on the contrary, I do not receive it, I will work just as hard in opposition to it." Whew, that's quite a baptism statement. Well, Marietta was baptized on July 30th, 1865 at Amboy, Illinois by Zenas Gurley Sr., and she was confirmed under Gurley's hands and the hands of W.W. Blair. I think she sums it up best when she later reflected on her reintroduction to the church in the 1860s. She said, quote, "I heard and knew the restored gospel and embraced it. With this knowledge came the earnest desire to labor no longer for oneself, but for others," end quote. She was known for her work ethic, organizational skills, and an incredible efficiency in multitasking and plain busybodiness. This is shown in a story her daughter shared. She said, "Mother got up one morning and sandwich and prepared breakfast. When she looked at the clock, she discovered that it was 3 o'clock in the morning. She got the family up anyway, because there wasn't any use to waste the food. Grandmother came out of the bedroom carrying her cap in hand saying, 'Land of Goshen, Marietta, what's the matter now?'" During her time in the Plano area, she worked with Mark Forscutt as an editor on the 1867 New Translation of the Bible, or what's traditionally called the Inspired Version of the Bible. Joseph Smith III also roped her into taking an active role at the Herald, where she wrote the Little Folks column. In 1869, she started a church publication for children that was called Zion's Hope. And less than 3 years after her baptism, Marietta and a group of women made their voices heard at the 1868 General Conference. For years, women were wanting to have a larger role in the mission of the church, especially an opportunity to vote on some of the major issues confronting the church. When they raised these concerns at the 1868 General Conference, they were scolded by the leadership. The group of women left the conference, but the issue was anything but over. Marietta crafted a letter to Joseph Smith III that both rehashed the events at the General Conference in a very clever King James Bible style. And here's a few excerpts from that letter written unto King Joseph from the daughters of Israel. She writes, "And with great joy they did set their faces toward the city of King Joseph, and did make haste unto the tabernacle in which were assembled the priests and Levites, together with the king and all the honorable men. But behold, it came to pass that this thing did not favor in the eyes of the king. And when they had looked that his countenance should have been pleasant unto them, they found that his anger was kindled. And with much fear and trembling, some of them said, Behold the face of the king. It is not unto us at former times. Let us depart, lest peradventure we be cast out. And so all Israel shall hear of this folly. And now, behold, they returned unto their own land, but not as they had gone up. For their countenances was changed, and their hearts were heavy, that they were not counted worthy a place in the assembly, but were as those who had taken the uppermost seat and had been bidden down. But now, when the second day of assembly had come, behold, it came into the heart of the king to repent of his anger towards the daughters of Israel, and that he had cast them out of the assembly of the people, and had reproved them in the presence of all the nobles of his realm. Now when this was known unto them, that the king had repented, and bade them return, it did not restore unto them the joy which had filled their hearts, when they had communed one with another concerning the going up hither, for like autumn leaves it was scattered upon the ground. And behold, thus they answered the king, Surely we will not go up unto the assembly, neither come nigh unto it. Nevertheless, as for thee, O king, Let not thy mind be troubled because of the daughters of thy people, for they are thy true and loyal subjects. Only grant me, beseech thee, that thine handmaidens may remain in their own land. So shalt thou be welcome to their home, and in time they shall forget how great was their humiliation. Well, perhaps it will come as no surprise, women did get a voice in the conference. Isaac Sheen introduced a resolution with the words, "Resolved that in the opinion of this conference, all the members of the church, male and female, have a right to vote on all questions that may be brought before the general conference." Marietta, in many ways, did her part to help move the women of the church one step closer to the priesthood. Well, keeping in mind, during this time, Marietta is a single mother caring for young Lucy, working at the publishing house, organizing women of the church, and improving her faith community. In a column early in 1869, Marietta talked about the responsibility of mothers to their children. A woman named Sister Weeks disagreed with Marietta and suggested that fathers, too, bore the same responsibility. Marietta responded to Sister Weeks, noting that she saw the world through her own experience of being the sole party responsible for her child's development. The debate was friendly and enriching. It also gives us insight into Marietta's personal life as the sole provider for her child and for herself. Well, at the end of that year, Marietta marries Samuel Fry Walker, a Nevada rancher. Elijah and Emeline Banta hosted the ceremony in their home on November 7th, 1869. Samuel's story, I think, is just as fascinating as Marietta's. He was born in Ohio, just like her, but spent much of his time exploring the country, pursuing his education, along with a variety of occupations involving farming, ranching, work in a carriage shop, engineering work on the Mississippi, and mining. He was born in Ohio, but lived all over the country. He was a candidate on the first Republican ticket in Sierra County, California, running for state legislature. Sam was a loyal Republican until his dying days. He was an ardent Methodist until he met Marietta while passing through Plano, Illinois in 1869. When he joined the reorganization, Walker helped establish the Lamoni Gazette and served as editor until his death in 1889. He was also a writer for the Herald and authored the book Ruins Revisited and the World Story Retold. I think the latter is still available in print. He was a poet, a writer, an intellectual, and had a passion for learning that was equal to Marietta's. In many ways, I think Marietta met her match when she met Samuel Fry Walker. Well, shortly after they married, Samuel and Marietta moved to Nye County, Nevada. They had two daughters, Frances and Lois, both born during their time in Nevada. They were there from 1870 to 1878. This was a time of social isolation for Marietta as they lived in a very rural area far from her church community. She missed her sister, featured here, very much. Emeline stayed behind in Sandwich with her family. The Walker family lived on the ranch in Nevada for a few years before gathering back to Sandwich, probably around the time that Emeline passed away. They were in Sandwich for a short time. Then they went to Lamoni, Iowa area in the late 1870s. This period in Nevada and her early years in Lamoni were not ones where Marietta felt like she did much work outside of the home. She writes Olive Flower that it wasn't until her family moved to Lamoni, until her husband passed in 1889, and her daughters were married and out of the home, that she felt free for other responsibilities outside of the house. She writes, "It was not until after I came to Iowa that I had ever thought of returning to anything in the line of literary work. This time it was not as a teacher, but I was for many years in close connection with the publishing house of the church of which I was a member. Early in this time on the Iowa farm, I seemed awakened from a long sleep by the spirit with which I had been imbued at Oxford and unknowingly had brought with me to the wide stretching prairies of Iowa." Her years in Lamoni were spent serving as editor of Zion's Hope, a children's resource begun in Plano and the magazine Autumn Leaves, a resource for young adults. Marietta served as editor of the Autumn Leaves for 17 years. She worked to create the Zion's Religio Literary Society for Youth in 1893 and helped publish Stepping Stones for junior age youth, along with a number of books for church members of all ages, including a book on church history that was titled With the Church in an Early Day. Marietta cared deeply about the education of the youth in the church and their participation in the faith community. This is evident in a letter she pens to a young Elbert A. Smith. Elbert submitted a poem shortly after his baptism into the church. He was around 16 years old. Marietta Walker published his poem in Zion's Hope. She wrote a very thoughtful and encouraging letter to Elbert around the time the poem was published. While receiving her letter and seeing his name in print gave Elbert a huge boost to his self-confidence as a writer and a poet. It also inspired him to immediately begin writing poem after poem after poem and sending them all to Marietta. She responded graciously with a word of advice that Elbert said probably did more good than the first letter of praise. In her second letter, Marietta told him that art is long and that excellence is not attained easily. Elbert said years later that Marietta helped him see that writing involved both perspiration and inspiration. It's interesting to note that years later, this young man followed Marietta Walker as editor of the Autumn Leaves and also the Herald. A motto she often used as she addressed youth was the well-known one, "Get thy spindle and thy distaff ready, and God will send thee flax." Roy Cheville reflected on her motto and said, this was hardly adequate for her. She would not wait for God to send her flax. She would go out and raise some. Then she and God would go to work. In 1886, a woman named Lucy Lloyd penned a letter to the editor of the Saints Herald expressing the need for space within the pages of the Herald that focused specifically on the needs of women in the church. Her request was granted, and the following month, the Mother's Home column appeared as a regular column in the church publication. It was the first of many Mother's Home columns that would appear in the Saints Herald for decades. Joseph Smith III invited Marietta to act as editor of the column. She received so many letters from around the church that it was impossible to respond to them all. The column gave counsel. It encouraged healthy diets, clean homes, and invited discussion on all issues related to the church. It was quite popular, even among some of the men of the church. The Mother's Home column wasn't loved by all, though, and some pushback was given specifically in regards to why women should have a column carved out for the Herald just for them. Marietta's response appeared in the Herald. She writes, "We believe that the time is not far distant when the church will have to speak upon this vexed question, the question of women's work in the church. To the sisters who have sustained the home column, let us say one word. The column has been appropriated to your use, and as long as the Board of Publications and the editorial management of the Herald see proper to sustain it, why should you notice or feel hurt in the least when some good brother complains that he is not getting the right kind of food? He has our free permission to skip that part of the Herald for more congenial reading, and he should remember that the body has many members, and these members may possibly differ as widely in taste as in office. May possibly differ as widely in taste as in office." Well, her leadership, involvement, and along with the women's organizations raised the question about women's work in the church. Marietta responds in another Mother's Home column in 1894 that is pretty clear on her perspective of women in the faith community. She writes, "When the church was closest in communion with God, then woman was recognized as a help, not only in the sacred relations of home, but also in the work of the gospel. But upon the other hand, when in any dispensation the church departed from God, then the position of woman was changed, and she was more or less looked upon as being the inferior of man. God sent Miriam before his ancient people. Paul commanded the saints to assist Phoebe in her work, and we understand by this that they were to honor her in her calling. And in this last dispensation, again, as in the time of Moses, God sent Emma Smith to go before the sisters of the church and to do among them the work needing to be done by woman. And she was just as much to be honored in her calling as was Joseph in his. And her work was just as important in its place as was her husband's. And if she and her work had been honored, the church might not have been saved from apostasy. Well, she responded again in 1911 in an article titled Woman's Work in the Reorganization. She wrote, in every age and every dispensation, history records that ever in the Church of God, woman has borne her full share of work, whether that work was moral, intellectual, or physical. And I think that without even a shadow of a doubt, I may be permitted to say that the work done by the women of this reorganization will compare favorably with that of the church in any age of its existence. In our church, woman is not supposed to enter the ministry, has never been ordained to the priesthood, but when the reflecting mind takes in the vast scope of her work, methinks this question of the ministry will be found a bit difficult of solution, and it may come to the mind of some to inquire if there is not possibly an unordained ministry whose work may equal that of the ordained. Well, she championed women's work in the church, and Joseph Smith III said that he valued his conversations with her and counsel regarding gospel work and intellectual affairs. Well, through her leadership in the Mother's Home column, Marietta became an experienced fundraiser for a variety of church projects. She founded the Home Column Missionary Fund, which sponsored missionary travel and service. She raised dollars for Zion's Hope, that children's paper, and a missionary boat called the Emeline. One of the many ways women raised money for the Home Column Missionary Fund was by individuals determining their donation amounts by their age. For example, a sister would donate as many pennies as she was old. The women also encouraged the children to send their spending money to E.L. Kelly, the church bishop, to use for the gospel boat. Through her column in the Herald, she initiated the Christmas Offering Fund for missionaries, and the amount raised in 1900 alone kept 5 elders in the field that year. An additional program that originated from her column was the Prayer League, a group of women devoted to improving faith, wisdom, a devotional spirit, and to fit and aid us in our work in the home, the Sabbath school, the church, and the press, and for the more general diffusion of Christian unity and love, end quote. Like the Mother's Home column, the Prayer League served as an unofficial support network for women around the church to support one another in a variety of capacities, from household tasks and recipes to needed prayers and spiritual direction. I did get a kick out of one minister's concern that if the women were allowed to have separate prayer meetings unsupervised, he said, quote, "Who knows what the women will pray for," end quote. Marietta's work also involved co-authoring a book with Henry Stebbins in 1888 called A Compendium of the Faith and Doctrine of the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for the use of the ministry and of Sabbath schools. It was a pretty important book that was used in the church up until the 1950s. The book was used by missionaries and branch members when needing to defend the RLDS church and instruct members about the faith of the true church. Although Marietta contributed to the church for decades as a writer, editor, and publisher, her work was not limited to pen and paper alone. She was an organizer. While living in Sandwich, Marietta and her sister Emeline began the Society of Gleaners in July of 1867. According to Madeline Brunson, the Society of Gleaners is the first record of a local women's organization within the reorganization. In Lamoni, Marietta helps her fellow sisters in the church establish the Daughters of Zion and the Women's Auxiliary for Social Service. The mission of these organizations were to assist women in serving their community, raise money for the church, promote loving homes, teach children the gospel principles, and to help ease the burdens of the poor. In Lamoni, a children's home for the orphan children of the community was built. In addition, a saints' home was constructed to care for the senior members of the community. As I mentioned earlier, Marietta was not alone in these endeavors. She was surrounded by other females in the church who cared just as passionately. Women like Catherine Cassie Kelly, Anna Stedman, Abby Horton, Callie Stebbins, and Audentia Smith Anderson, they served active roles in these organizations. They were the women leaders. She was influential in initiating the first general conference, action taking on establishing a church college in Lamoni. As though that wasn't enough, she donated her own farmland to the educational cause, designating Lamoni as the home to Graceland College, now university, and Marietta Walker's deserved title years later as the mother of Graceland. As Marietta grew older, her hearing and sight began to fade. Her actions grew slower and more calculated. In her late years, she traveled to see children and grandchildren in Des Moines and California. As her activity and published writings decreased, her influence in church leadership began to fade as well. Where she once had the ear of the church president, Joseph Smith III, she found that with his son, Frederick M. Smith, she had far less influence. In fact, she openly criticized him at times with friends and fellow church leaders. Marietta was not a fan of supreme directional control, to say the least. After reading an article written by Paul Hansen upon his return from the Holy Land, she sends a letter to Paul that was dated October 6, 1928. And in it, she says, "Ever since you returned from Palestine, I have been looking to you to stand for the things we believe to be right. Of late, I have wondered if you would accept all that the church now is committed to. I am so thankful now to find in your article that you are striking from the shoulder and that I have no reason to be disappointed in you." Marietta dictated this letter, and in a postscript, her scribe, C.B. Stebbins, includes the following note to Hansen. "Sister Walker wants me to add that she has thought that Bishop McGuire and his counselors made a grand mistake when they surrendered the properties of the church. When she saw Brother Elbert a short time ago, she told him in the presence of others she expected to remain a member of the church as long as she lived, and she had expected the reorganized church to be the church triumphant, but never with Fred M. at the head." President Smith heard some of Marietta's criticisms and wrote her in July of 1926. He writes, "To put it mildly, dear sister, I am grieved. As a boy in school and college, you failed to understand me. But as I entered upon my work as a church man, you seemed to have a better understanding of my great interest in the welfare of the church. And I was always grateful for that understanding with one of whose ability and devotion to the church I held in such high esteem. Perhaps I have presumed too much about that understanding. May I make, before it is too late, at least one effort to be understood by you. Will you write me, if not too burdensome for you, what you think my attitude on church government is, or what you have been told it is?" Well, I don't have a record of Marietta's response to FM's letter, if there was even a response at all. In April of 1930, the RLDS Church gathered for its annual general conference and to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the church's founding. Although Marietta was not able to attend this conference, she was in California with her daughter's family. She was not forgotten at the conference. She received a telegram of birthday wishes from the General Conference on April 10th in celebration of her 96th birthday. In addition to the conference greetings, the youth of the Santa Ana and Long Beach, California congregations called and greeted her. She was excited to have them there. As she was hard of hearing and bedimmed of eyesight, she could feel the energy from her chair there in California. Sadly, she passed away 2 days later. Word of Marietta's passing reached the General Conference on Sunday, April 13th, as church members were assembled in the auditorium for the morning service. There were nearly 7,000 assembled in the auditorium to hear the news of Marietta's passing. The conference responded with a moment of silence to honor her memory. 2 services were held in her honor. Fred M. Smith held a service at the Stone Church in Independence on Thursday, April 17th. And President Smith, the young man who tested Marietta's patience in Sunday school when she began her work for the reorganization, he delivered her funeral sermon at the Stone Church. In that sermon, he highlighted Marietta's life and shared the, quote, outstanding contributions to the church, end quote. It was a list of 9 highlights of Marietta's ministry. This list of accomplishments is a small slice of the remarkable impact she made to the reorganization. It highlighted that she was among the first that had the vision of a college sponsored by the church. Highlighted that she gave a large acreage for Graceland. It highlighted that she was one of the organizers of the Religio. This first took the form of a debating society in her home. Said that she started the Mother's Home column in the Herald, which she later helped develop the Daughters of Zion, which at that time was the Department of Women merged into the Department of Religious Education. At the time of her funeral, it was that. For years, she was the editor of the Zion's Hope and founder of the Autumn Leaves. She wrote the book With the Church in an Early Day. Fred M. highlighted that she commenced the Christmas offering and that she was a strong supporter of the gospel vote, the Evangelium. Well, at the same hour of the service in Independence, there was a service held in Lamoni, a place she called home for over 50 years. Graceland students were dismissed the day of her funeral, and a Graceland a cappella choir sang for her funeral service. I'll close today's story with a few words from her funeral sermon. Here you can see an old picture of Rose Hill and her headstone, her cemetery stone. And here are the words from her funeral sermon. In her life's work and association, she has shown to what lofty height womanhood can be lifted. Her example invites emulation by all, young or old, who know her. She has shown us the ways of humility, of faith, of courage, and of perseverance in the ways of righteousness. Or as Roy Cheville described Marietta's life and legacy, she made things happen.
Thank you so much, Barb. What a fascinating life she lived, and what a gift she was to the church.
And thank you all for hanging on all the way to the end. I am going to share my screen here because I have a few announcements to share about church history events in the future. This summer lecture series has gone so well, we are happy to announce that your friends at the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation are planning to host a fall lecture series. The series theme is Church History Without Boundaries, recognizing that due to COVID-19, we can't take a church history tour this year. So instead, we thought we would do a virtual bus tour that travels the world exploring the global history of Community of Christ. The fall lecture series will feature an awesome group of guest speakers. You can see a few of those speakers on your screen now. John Hamer will present the story of R.C. Evans and the church in Canada. Demi Hurlbut will share the story of Gobert Edit and Community of Christ in Southeast Nigeria. In fact, he just received an award for an article he wrote on this topic from the Mormon History Association. Steve Shields will drop by and share the history of the church in Korea and Japan. We will also see the return of a few familiar faces from the summer series. Andrew Bolton will share the history of the church in the British Isles, a story that began during the 1830s Kirtland period. David Howlett will talk about our history in India. Seth Bryant will speak on the islands of the sea. And I'll do my best to share the story of the many women from church history who lived and served in the Holy Land. We're in the process of confirming lecture titles and dates with our guest speakers this week, but I hope to have additional information about the fall lecture series available on our website by the end of the month. We'll be sure to send out an email announcement with additional information about the fall series and a link to register for the online lectures. This series is going to be just like what we're doing now. It'll be every Thursday night at 7 Central. As they say, stay tuned for more information. It'll be headed your way. In addition, our friends from the John Whitmer Historical Association are launching their first online conference on Saturday, September 19th at 5:30 p.m. Central Time. Dan Whitmer will host, And guest speakers include our friend, David Howlett. He's going to speak on the topic of the story of the evacuees, a Filipino congregation, a Cold War insurgency, and the development of the first RLDS NGO from 1972 through 74. This lecture is a continuation of the lecture that he shared with us a few weeks ago. So if you watched his lecture before, don't worry, this lecture is going to be different. You won't be hearing the same lecture twice. We're in this online conference. The second speaker, who you see here, Dr. P. Jane Hoffman, is presenting a lecture called Nor Any Manner of Ites, American Indians and Mormons. The online conference is going to be free to JWHA members and $10 for non-members, $5 for college students. For more information or to register for the special event, and you have to register for it, just go to www.jwha.info, the website you see on your screen here. So now we'll bring our evening program to a close. And thank you, Peter, for acting as our gracious host tonight and for all the work you have done as a co-host throughout the summer lecture series. Thank you, Megan, for helping co-host tonight and for all your behind the scenes magic over the past 8 weeks. Also, thank you both for agreeing to come back for the fall lecture series. We couldn't do this without you. Lastly, we share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for sharing your time with us and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation with your donations. We simply could not host this evening event and all the events that we have hosted throughout this series without your generosity. In fact, over the past 7 weeks, you have generously given $9,000 in donations through this lecture series. So thank you so much for helping preserve and share church history. Until we meet again, take care, friends. Keep reading your church history, and we look forward to seeing you this fall when together we will explore the exciting global history of Community of Christ. Thank you, everyone, and good night.